The Metroid franchise has some fantastic and very distinct design tropes. We've seen these all across the series and within the genre Metroidvanias. Now, even if the series has been a bit stagnant as of late, the genre itself has been thriving, with new titles popping up and bringing some pretty innovative ideas to the table. So, with Metroid Prime 4 on the horizon, what ideas should be taken on board? Considering it's been over 10 years since the last Prime title, it's important to think about how far the genre has come and what its core elements are. So let's take a look at some staple designs from previous Metroid entries and some titles outside the series that should be considered for the design of Metroid Prime 4. Now, before we go over any specifics, we need to briefly cover what makes a Metroidvania game. There are three things that make up all games in this genre: self-directed exploration, backtracking, and experimentation. Self-directed exploration means traversing areas without a linear or obvious path. Sometimes there'll be a waypoint or a bit of direction, and other times not. But either way, the way the player explores is completely self-directed in which pathways they choose and which order they scout areas. Backtracking is rather self-explanatory, but means an emphasis on revisiting or re-exploring specific locations over and over again. This typically involves the player exploring a small amount of it, retrieving a special ability that opens up more of this area, and then revisiting it to continue the game's progression. And finally, experimentation involves a problem with a sometimes obvious, sometimes not so obvious solution that the player may or may not have. At certain times, the player will reach a dead end and will have to reevaluate their abilities and where they may be able to explore, experimenting to see what mechanic will provide a solution to whatever blockade they face. These three aspects are the core of any real Metroidvania, and they are deeply interlocked with one another. Now, with these fundamentals down, let's review some designs that would enhance them. One of Metroid's biggest strengths is undoubtedly its ability to unravel information through environmental storytelling. This is just a great lesson in game design that more developers should consider, which is truly interactive storytelling. Even though games are an interactive medium, they're often told through passive storytelling, with cutscenes for example. Now, there's nothing wrong with passive storytelling, but there's so much potential with video games because of the interaction aspect. Having to listen to dialogue while walking from A to B is not interactive storytelling, which is something that happens in way too many games today. There are so many ways you can have effective world building, which is often more meaningful to the player because they're the ones who interact with it themselves. This is something that lends itself quite well to the Metroid series. With a larger focus on exploration, you can tell stories through environmental details, scan logs, atmosphere, and much more. A player might find some interesting details about the world just by wandering off the main path for a little bit, which rewards their interest in exploration. Interaction creates more involvement and thus more immersion. For example, in the beginning of Prime 2, you find all these dead troopers and can read their last journals, slowly piecing together the puzzle of what just happened. This is good because the story is being told through your efforts to discover these details. How much you learn is entirely up to you. A large majority of the rooms in the Prime Trilogy are bustling with details, world building, and things that expand upon the main story. But the best part about all of this is the interactive part. The player doesn't have to read through every page of lore and carefully comb over every detail if they don't want to. They can consume as much as they want, so they don't get burnt out as a result. And that's the beauty of it. They get out as much as they put in. And video games can perform this type of storytelling in a way that no other medium can. And because of this, it feels like they discovered these details on their own, and are thus learning about the world in the same way that Samus is. This is probably one of the most definitive characteristics of the Metroid games, and I really can't see Metroid Prime 4 without it. With backtracking as a key staple of the genre, there's often a need to keep things fresh and interesting when passing through the same room close to a dozen times. A way to achieve this is with evolving environments, areas that change in contents or their nature as the game progresses. There's a multitude of ways to achieve this, but the most common is with new areas to progress. For example, pathways or items you can't quite get to in the beginning, but may be open to you when you return down the line. You can also use new or more dangerous enemies encountered, or a change of atmosphere. Point is, having the world change because of your actions can make the experience a whole lot more immersive. These simple techniques can give new meaning to almost any location. It's an effective way to keep the player on their toes in areas they thought they'd mastered. Let's look outside of the series for a good example, specifically from a recent Metroidvania, Hollow Knight. Mild mid-game spoilers for Hollow Knight, just a warning. Forgotten Crossroads is the first main area of the game and works as a way to ease you into the controls and mechanics. Though later on, you return and the area becomes harsh and mutated, with larger and stronger versions of the previous creatures. This is a complete parallel and catches the player off guard. An area that was safe and familiar is now a brand new challenge. Even the color scheme is a dramatic and distinct contrast, further emphasizing the change in the level. Changing an existing area should be done cautiously though, because having a static environment you come back to serves a good purpose pacing-wise. Being able to now obliterate enemies that once gave you trouble is incredibly satisfying, and is another staple of the Metroid series. Also, familiarity is crucial in a Metroidvania. If you're required to backtrack through a large amount of areas that change so much that you've become completely lost, it can hurt the overall experience. This means level design, key landmarks, and distinct areas become a navigational tool for the player. But the main idea is to make areas evolve or change in some way, whether it be mechanically, atmospherically, or even both. A world shouldn't be static, and the player's actions should affect it in some meaningful way, while maintaining some familiarity. With the amount of navigation required in Metroid, having an effective mapping system is crucial. Metroid's maps are pretty well designed and are very functional, but there's a level of improvement that could be had in the form of map management. In recent years, we've seen some games turn a mapping system into its own unique part of the game. Many titles have made this a standard practice, within Metroidvanias and outside of the genre. The ability to place markers and symbols anywhere on your map is essentially a no-brainer, but there's no real use of it in the Metroid series so far. There's tremendous value in the ability to mark and interact with the mapping system, considering much of Metroid's gameplay is examining routes and pathways that haven't been explored yet, and figuring out where to go next. This goes beyond story progress. The whole gameplay loop is seeing something you can't get and returning later when you've acquired an ability that allows you to do so. There's an abundance of small items, collectibles, and upgrades that don't register on the map system. Or in the case of the 2D Metroid games, which often do insert icons for the aforementioned items, there's no level of description, hierarchy, or priority. Handing this responsibility over to the player brings a new dimension of ownership to their exploration, and gives a level of satisfaction that comes with exploring the world in their own way. The ability to track and mark the locations of these items for them to revisit later provides a huge payoff that would feel extremely rewarding, because it's their own effort that allowed them to do so. This is essentially a quality of life improvement. It doesn't streamline the backtracking experience, but removes some of the tedium if they're completely lost and clueless about what to do. It also confronts the issue of returning to a playthrough after you've forgotten some key details. Sure, you may remember the overall objective, but the smaller details are often forgotten. This is quite a sizable issue the genre faces, since there's a huge reliance on the player's own memory and sense of direction. It's often what causes someone to put down one of these games indefinitely. This essentially gives the player a tool to make their backtracking experience far easier and more rewarding. The mentioned staples are just some of many elements that make this series one of Nintendo's best. We don't know what Metroid Prime 4 will look like, but hopefully it'll include some if not all of these ideas and will continue to be the icon of great game design it always has been. It's been quite the wait since the previous Prime title, and the series has been pretty stagnant since the mid-2000s. But even though the series itself has been quiet, the genre it kickstarted is thriving. So maybe we'll see a resurgence in the series with Metroid Prime 4. Who knows? I hope so at least. I'm Prime Hylian, and thanks for watching.